Have you ever wondered what it would be like to wake up in a world completely destroyed, where everything you knew has simply disappeared? Imagine leaving a safe place to face a silence that seems to scream the end of everything. This was the day Noah and his family faced, the day the earth began anew. What if I told you that in this time of despair, God not only brought judgment, but also a real chance to start over, with a purpose that can change your life today? If you feel lost, trapped by past mistakes, or that your faith is no longer strong, you need to understand this moment, because it is precisely in this crisis that God offers the most powerful renewal you can imagine. Stay with me until the end, because I will reveal how this ancient story is the key to transforming your own new beginning, filling your life with hope and mission. Before we move on, let me remind you, most of the people who watch these videos are not yet subscribed to the channel. If you want to receive more content that strengthens your faith and brings real solutions for your spiritual life, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Don't miss out on what God has prepared for you. No one was ready for the silence that followed. When the doors of the ark finally opened and Noah took his first step outside, there was no birdsong, no footsteps, no distant voices. What was left was a sodden ground, a grey sky, and a damp smell of wood and turned earth. The landscape was unlike anything that had existed before. Trees had fallen, mud was everywhere, and an emptiness that tightened the chest. This was the new world, but it still bore the weight of judgment. Noah paused for a few seconds before stepping forward, as if trying to understand what God wanted him to see there. The ground that had once supported cities and families now seemed to have been swept clean. It was as if the planet itself had stopped to breathe again. It wasn't a pretty new beginning. It was raw, real, heavy, but it was a new beginning. Each step Noah took on that clay was like a silent prayer. He wasn't just carrying tools and seeds, he was carrying the responsibility of all humanity. It was him, his wife, his sons, and his daughters-in-law. Nothing more. Everything outside that ark had been swept away by the waters. But there, in the midst of the silence, God kept them standing. There was a mission, even if no one had the strength to understand it all at that moment. The ark, which had once been a sign of madness to its neighbors, was now a reminder of God's faithfulness. It was a new chance, but with a weight on its shoulders that few could bear. God had not left survivors by chance, and Noah knew it. He wasn't just a righteous man. He was the only one with the breath to plant again, love again, start all over again. It was in this scenario that Noah built an altar, not to ask, but to give thanks. That act was not just a religious formality. It was a gesture of recognition. Even in the face of pain, loss, and devastation, he knew that being alive was a grace, that ground, even covered in mud, was the promised land. God accepted that sacrifice. The smoke that rose was not just from burning wood, it was from surrender. And there, in the middle of nowhere, God sealed a new stage with humanity. His blessing did not come with thunder or voices from the sky, but with the certainty in Noah's heart that everything still made sense. God not only judged the world, he was also willing to rebuild it with those who chose to obey. It was hard not to feel afraid. No one there knew what to expect. The animals left little by little, suspicious, as if they too sensed that something had changed forever. What had once been a land full of life was now a place where everything would have to be reinvented. But there was a flame burning inside Noah, something between faith and fear. He knew that God had not taken them out of the ark just to survive. There was a purpose, something greater than planting crops or raising children. It was a spiritual mission. God had given the earth a second chance, and that chance was in their hands. And it was on that first day, marked by silence and mud, that everything began again. They were days of great silence and work after they left the ark. Everything was new, but at the same time frightening. The sky, which had previously opened to pour out judgment, now seemed to observe calmly. And it was precisely on one of those days, without warning, that the sky changed shape. The clouds parted, and a different glow appeared among the drops that were still in the air. An arch, with colors they had never seen before, crossed the firmament from end to end. It was not only beautiful, it was imposing. It was as if God was signing with light what he had promised in Noah's heart. That rainbow, which today may seem ordinary, at that moment was something sacred. They understood. It was a direct sign from heaven. God spoke, and everyone understood. It was not a voice like that of men, but a certainty that descended into the soul. Never again, was what that vision said. Never again would the world be destroyed by waters. Never again would there be fear of total destruction. It was a firm promise, even knowing that human beings would still make mistakes, still sin, still forget. That was more than a gesture of peace. It was an eternal pact. God knew who he was dealing with, but he still chose to make a covenant. That, for Noah, was what made the most impact. The rainbow was not just a pretty symbol in the sky. It was a visible reminder that, despite judgment, God continues to be merciful. And that changes everything. Noah looked up to the sky and knew that this wasn't just for him. It was for his children and his children's children. It was a sign that would span generations. Every time they looked at that rainbow, they would remember that there was a day when the world almost ended, but didn't. They would remember that God is just, but also patient, that he punishes sin, but never abandons his plans for humanity. The Rainbow Covenant was like a watershed. God wasn't just giving people a second chance. He was building a bridge between heaven and earth, saying, I'm still here, even when you fail. This was the foundation for all the other covenants that would come after. And there, in that field still full of mud and the smell of wet wood, Noah understood that he was under a promise, not by merit, but by grace. The arch in the sky was like a weapon hanging, pointing upward, indicating that the war was over. God was no longer a judge with a gavel in his hand, but a father who wanted to restore. That symbol changed the spiritual climate of that place. Where there had been only fear, now there was security. Where there had been silence, now there was hope. It was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a covenant that would span the centuries, and that still speaks to all who look to the sky in search of answers. The silence after the flood still hung heavy in the air, but along with the clear sky and the rainbow came a new command. It was as if God's own heart spoke directly to Noah's heart. Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. It wasn't just about having children, it was a sending, a spiritual calling. God was starting over with this small group, and it was no light mission. They had to populate an empty world, but they also had to rebuild values, principles, and fear. It was more than just planting vineyards and caring for animals. It was restoring the original plan. This command, which had previously been given to Adam, was now repeated with new weight and new hope. It was as if God were saying, this time, do it differently. Noah understood that he could not repeat the mistakes of the past. The multiplication that God asked for was not just biological, it was spiritual. It was about forming a generation that would know the God who saves, who judges, and who loves. Each child that was born would also be a chance to teach about the flood, about the ark, about the promise of the rainbow. It was an opportunity to keep the memory of what happened alive, not as a trauma, but as a warning. The new world needed to be full, but it also needed to be pure. God wanted an inhabited earth, yes, but by people who knew who he is. It was a reconstruction in every sense, and Noah knew that this began within his own home. Noah's sons were grown men, but they were being called to a mission that spanned generations. They weren't just living for themselves, they were carrying the beginnings of entire peoples. It wasn't possible to take it all in at once, but the weight of responsibility was there. With each new camp set up, each seed planted, there was a reminder. We are here because God wanted us to be here. Faith was no longer a theory. It was what kept everyone going. The world outside was silent, but within this family there was movement. They were filling the earth, slowly, but with purpose. And that was part of the covenant. It was impossible to ignore that a new beginning was underway. The earth, once covered in water, was now breathing again. And the mission to multiply made sense because it was a response to God's love. Noah looked at his sons and knew each step they took was important. Each child they would have would tell a story. The story of a God who did not give up on the world, even when the world sank into evil. God's call was clear. It was not just about survival, it was about witnessing. And in the heart of that old man, there was one certainty. To multiply was also to spread God's presence. And that gave meaning to everything. In the first few days after the flood, Noah began to notice something different about the animals. In the ark, during the confinement, many of them stayed close together, as if they had understood that they were safe there. It was a respectful coexistence, sometimes even peaceful. But outside the ark, in the open world, full of uncertainty, something had changed. The animals now moved away. They were afraid. They watched from afar, ready to run at the slightest movement. It wasn't anger, it was fear, as if something invisible had been established between man and the creatures. And this was no coincidence. God had done it this way. It was a new balance. Noah understood that this was more than animal instinct. It was mutual protection. God had placed a limit, a natural barrier, to prevent chaos. Before, man had dominion over the animals, but now this dominion would be exercised with more distance and responsibility. It was a reminder that man had failed before, and that now he needed to tread more carefully. The fear of animals was a sign that something spiritual had been established. There was no longer the familiarity of Eden. Sin had left deep scars. Even in the relationship with animals, the world was no longer the same. But there was wisdom in this new dynamic. Distancing, avoided confrontation and preserved life. God knew what he was doing. By instilling fear in the animals, he was giving man not only authority but also limits. It was as if he were saying, "You can rule, but you don't own everything." Noah realized that, even with the right to use the animals for work or food, there was something sacred in this relationship. It was no longer an innocent coexistence. It was a coexistence marked by mutual respect and fear. And this needed to be taken seriously. God didn't just restore the earth. He also adjusted relationships to maintain order. For Noah, the animals' new behavior was yet another confirmation that everything had changed. He saw their fear as a constant reminder of the fall of humanity, but also as proof of divine mercy. Because fear, in this case, was protection. It was God preventing man, still vulnerable and with a heart marked by sin, from destroying what was left of creation. Even the animals' instincts obeyed God's command. And that said a lot. Even the natural world recognized the Creator's authority. Noah carried this in his heart as yet another lesson of new beginnings. Even fear can be a form of God's care. When Noah and his family came down from the ark, they found no fields ready for harvest, no trees laden with crops as before. The earth, though alive, was still recovering. Buds were scarce, and famine soon knocked on the door. Then God allowed something he had never allowed before: meat. This came as a silent shock to Noah. All his life, he had lived on the fruits of the land, the seeds, the crops. Now, having access to meat was almost like crossing a spiritual boundary, but it was also a clear sign that God was providing, even in a devastated world. It wasn't just a matter of survival. The new permission came with responsibility. Killing an animal for food wasn't something you did lightly. There was weight, there was reverence. The act of eating now involved sacrifice, and this didn't go unnoticed by Noah. They knew they weren't simply consuming. They were participating in something that had previously belonged only to God, the management of life and death. It was a new time, with new rules. Eating, which had previously been simple and natural, now became a practice with profound meaning. Noah's family learned to handle this with care. It wasn't a party, it wasn't mundane, it was provision, it was grace. And at the same time, it was a constant reminder that everything they have comes from God. When they ate the flesh of animals, there was a silent prayer in every gesture, an acknowledgement, this is not mine, this is a gift. God was teaching them once again that life is not just about pleasure or abundance, it is about purpose. Even on the plate, there was holiness, and this transformed the way they viewed creation. It was no longer just a land to exploit, it was a land to care for with gratitude. This new food marked a spiritual turning point. Man was being treated as someone more mature, more aware. Humanity's childhood was over. Now was the time for responsibility. Eating meat was not a sign of power, it was a sign of dependence. And Noah knew this. He knew that the world had changed, and that even in small things like our daily meals, God was giving us signs. It was a reminder life goes on, but everything we have comes from the hands of the Creator, and each bite, no matter how simple, was an act of faith. Eating was also worship. Shortly after they began eating meat, God said something that left a deep impression on Noah. Meat could be eaten, yes, but blood, never. To modern eyes, this may seem like a detail, but there, in that context of a new beginning, this instruction sounded like something sacred. God was saying that blood represented life, and life was not man's possession. It belonged only to him. Noah understood that this was not just any rule, it was a line that could not be crossed. It was God reminding him that even though meat was food, life would always be sacred. This principle became so clear to Noah that he began to see each animal in a new light. It wasn't just a matter of killing for food. There was a ritual of respect embedded in it all. Every drop of blood that flowed carried a spiritual weight. It was as if the earth itself bore witness to this act. God had said, "Blood is life," and that rang out as a truth that could not be ignored. They were no longer in Eden, and they could not return. But even here, in this post-judgment world, there was still order, still dignity. God had not abandoned creation. He was redefining the boundaries with love and justice. It was also at this moment that God established something even more powerful. Whoever took the life of a human being would be held accountable. Human life, above all, was untouchable. It was as if God were saying, "You are my image. No one can touch this with impunity." For Noah, this was both frightening and comforting. Frightening because it brought weight to existence, comforting because it showed that God's justice had not died in the flood. It was still alive, strong, active. Blood spilled unjustly would not be ignored. Every death, every act of violence was recorded in the heavens, and this gave value to every living being. Little by little, Noah's family learned to live with this sense of reverence. They knew they were walking on land that had been washed clean by God's judgment. And now everything needed to be lived with greater awareness. The blood was a symbol. It was as if it spoke, and God listened. Noah did not know everything that lay ahead, but he was certain that this lesson, that life is sacred, was one of the greatest he had learned since he stepped off the ark. And this conviction became his inheritance, because even today, even after millennia, this truth still echoes among those who fear God. Life does not belong to man. The day Noah lost control came without warning, at a time no one expected. After so much suffering and rebuilding, he, who seemed to be the pillar of the family, gave in to a simple but devastating human weakness: drunkenness. That afternoon, the silence of the house was broken by the strong smell of wine, and Noah, exhausted, let himself go. For him, it was perhaps an attempt to relieve the pressure of everything he had experienced, a moment of rest from the weight he was carrying. But what seemed like a small mistake opened a deep wound in the family dynamics. It was Ham who saw it all first. His father unconscious, vulnerable, without the dignity that Noah had always maintained. Instead of acting respectfully or trying to cover up the difficult moment, Ham chose to mock and expose the scene. It was more than a mistake. It was an act that revealed the hardened heart of a son who did not know how to honor his father. His brothers, Shem and Japheth, on the other hand, acted differently. With reverence, they covered their father, protecting his image, even without understanding the gravity of what had happened. That marked forever the way honor and dishonor were manifested within the family. Noah's response the next day was painful and surprising. Despite his failure, he spoke out with authority, not to condemn himself, but to pronounce a curse on Ham's son, Canaan. That moment revealed that even the righteous have their downfalls, and that the consequences of one person's actions can affect many. Noah, marked by pain and disappointment, made it clear that respect within the family was not optional, and that dishonor had real consequences. It was a hard lesson, but a necessary one in maintaining the balance between honor and justice. This episode was etched in the memory of his family and everyone around him. It showed that no one is free from human frailty, not even those who walk with God. It also taught that the way we deal with the weaknesses of others reveals who we really are. The weight of honor, grace, and forgiveness went hand in hand, but it required courage and humility. For Noah, that experience was a turning point, a reminder that being righteous does not mean being perfect, and that true strength lies in recognizing our faults and seeking reconciliation. After the flood, when the earth was beginning to become habitable again, Noah and his sons saw a landscape of possibilities and responsibilities unfold before them. Each of his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, was the beginning of a line that would shape the future of nations. It was a moment filled with weight, because it was not just about generating descendants, but about paving the way for what God had planned for the world. For those who knew them, the faces and stories of those sons were more than just names. They were the living promise of humanity's new beginning. As the family walked through the water-washed land, diversity began to show itself in each village that emerged. Cultural differences, languages, and customs were there, not by chance, but as part of a greater plan. The genealogy that seemed to be just a simple record became, in Noah's eyes, a spiritual map. Each nation had its role, its prophetic destiny. The lineage of Shem, for example, carried the hope that from there would come the bridge that would unite God and humanity, the promised Messiah. It was the basis for a future that was still invisible, but certain. Little by little, the family realized that the dispersion was not just geographic, but also spiritual. They needed to not only populate the earth, they needed to fill it with values, faith, and the fear of God. The memory of judgment and covenant needed to be preserved, passed down from generation to generation. It was a difficult task, in a world still marked by deep scars, but also full of hope. Noah felt deep in his heart that this dispersion was essential so that humanity would not repeat the mistakes of the past. This understanding forever shaped Noah's view of his children and their descendants. Each people had a place in God's heart, and a purpose to fulfill no matter how many times humanity failed. Diversity, far from being a problem, was part of God's plan from the beginning. And so, in that new land, the mosaic of nations began to form, with the weight of history, the responsibility of faith, and the promise of redemption yet to come. The moment when humanity, gathered in one place, decided to build a tower that would reach the sky was fraught with pride and disobedience. To those who observed, it seemed like an ambitious plan, a demonstration of strength and unity. But behind that desire to reach the sky, there was a hidden desire to defy God and impose human power above the divine order. It was the same arrogance that had led man to err so many times before, a repetition of the sin of Eden, only on a collective scale. As the stones were being raised, the murmur of the crowd grew louder, and the tower rose higher and higher. But God, who was attentive to everything, saw that this project was not just a physical construction, it was a symbol of rebellion. To prevent humanity from losing itself completely in its ambition, he decided to intervene definitively. The confusion of languages was not a harsh punishment without purpose, but a form of mercy to prevent pride from further destroying the future of mankind. That difficult and painful dispersion brought a new chance. With the diversity of languages and the separation of people, the true unity that God wanted became clear. It could only exist through obedience and humility before him, not through human ambition or power. It was a moment of learning for humanity, albeit a hard one, showing that genuine communion depends on reverence for God. There, in the confusion of Babel, was born the spiritual origin of languages and cultures, a constant reminder that true connection needs to be built on faith and respect. For Noah and his descendants, this episode reinforced the importance of their pact with God and the mission entrusted to them to spread out with fear and wisdom without repeating the mistakes of the past. It was the end of one era and the beginning of another, in which diversity would make humanity more complex, but also more dependent on divine grace. The tower that did not reach the sky became a symbol of human limitations, and the promise that, even in confusion, God is always ready to offer a way back. After this entire journey that begins with Noah's new beginning and goes through the covenant, the multiplication of nations and the rebellion at Babel, an essential question remains. What have you been doing to fulfill the mission that God has placed in your life? Are you living with purpose and fear, or are you letting pride take over? I would love to hear your opinion and experience. Share here in the comments how this story touched your heart and what it awakened in you. If you liked this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. That way, you won't miss any of the transformative content that we have carefully prepared to strengthen your faith and inspire your spiritual journey. And take the opportunity to watch the other videos on the channel. They have many powerful messages that can change your view of God, life, and your purpose. The path to a life with God is made up of steps, and each video is an invitation for you to take the next one. Thank you for being here, for your attention and your open heart. Until the next video, and may God bless you abundantly.